My name is Chris Bortz, and I'm a training specialist at Best Friends Animal Society. This short presentation is about giving feedback to volunteers. First of all, if you are a person who is uncomfortable with giving feedback, it's helpful to understand what feedback is and is not. It is not confrontation. A confrontation is described as hostile and argumentative, and that is definitely not something we want. So what is feedback? Feedback is information about how a person is doing as they work toward a goal. Remember playing the hot and cold game as a child? You gave feedback in a timely, direct, and specific way to help other people find whatever object they were looking for. They were cold if they were moving away from the object, and warm or hot if they were getting closer. When you are giving feedback to someone, it is just like that hot and cold game. When we talk about giving feedback to volunteers, our intent is to give them information as to how they're doing in an effort to reach a goal, to get them back on track, and overall to help the volunteer be successful. We often hear the terms positive feedback and negative feedback. You can also think of it as reinforcing feedback and redirecting feedback. Let's start by looking at reinforcing feedback. This is the easy part, right? Sharing the good stuff. But there are actually a couple of challenges with reinforcing feedback. First, it's how to give the feedback correctly, and second, how to give it often enough. Good job may seem like reinforcing feedback, but in order for feedback to be effective, it must be specific. So instead of just saying good job, you would say, good job on your timing with the clicker training. Reinforcing feedback also needs to be given frequently. This is especially true when someone is learning something new. Think back on the last time you tried to learn a new skill, like speaking another language or playing tennis. How successful would you have been, and how long would you have stuck with it if you rarely or never got any reinforcing feedback? What if the only time you got feedback was when you were doing something wrong? You would probably become frustrated and lose confidence in your ability to master the new skill. The same is true with volunteers, especially new volunteers. So how often should we be giving reinforcing feedback? Studies have shown that for optimum learning to occur, the ratio should be 5-to-1. 5 times as much reinforcing feedback as redirecting feedback. Now that is setting the bar pretty high. It's difficult, probably even unrealistic, to remember to give reinforcing feedback this often. But the takeaway here is that feedback plays an important role in helping someone learn. Now we'll talk about redirecting feedback. If you ask animal welfare staff about why they don't give feedback to volunteers, these are the types of answers you will probably hear. And while all of these reasons may be valid to some extent, the primary reason is probably the last one: being uncomfortable about giving feedback. That is especially true with redirecting feedback. If you're a person who is uncomfortable at the thought of giving redirecting feedback, remember, we are not talking about being confrontational. We are talking about helping a volunteer be successful by telling them how they are doing and guiding them back on track when necessary. You also want to remember that when we talk about volunteers working with animals, safety should always be a priority, and perhaps the motivation you need to speak up when someone needs redirection. It's our job to keep the animals, volunteers, staff, and general public safe at all times. Most people feel more comfortable about giving feedback, especially redirecting feedback, once they've learned some tips on what to do and what not to do. So let's take a look at those tips. When it comes to giving feedback, timing is important. It will be most effective if you give it right away, so don't procrastinate. The exception to this is if you or the volunteer are very emotional. Communication is rarely successful when emotions are running high. Most experts say that reinforcing feedback should be given privately, but really, for little things, such as how much kitty litter to put in the litter box, it's perfectly fine to just go ahead and give the redirection. In fact, pulling the person aside for a private conversation will probably make them feel uncomfortable because you would be making a much bigger deal out of it than is necessary. The exception would be if you know that this specific volunteer prefers that all redirecting feedback be given in private. If you are dealing with small incidents as they come up, you shouldn't have a big collection of issues and problems that need to be addressed with a volunteer. But even if you do, don't bring up more than 2 issues when giving feedback. Volunteers are more likely to feel attacked and less likely to address the problems if they are suddenly told about multiple things that they've been doing wrong. Just like with reinforcing feedback, redirecting feedback should be specific. Instead of, "You need to be more careful," say, "Please make sure that you lock the kennel doors when you come out so the dogs don't escape." The volunteer should be clear on what needs to be done in order to improve the situation. Research has shown that adult learners need to know why. "Because I said so" is not effective with adults. Giving them an explanation of why something needs to happen a certain way will actually increase the likelihood of them remembering what you've told them, as well as increasing the likelihood that they will do what you've asked. No matter how carefully you choose your words when giving redirecting feedback, your nonverbal signals can easily reveal how you really feel. As mentioned earlier, don't try to give feedback if you are in an emotional state, frustrated, angry, exasperated, etc. If necessary and appropriate, it may be better to ask a coworker to provide the redirection. Keeping in mind that our goal is to help the volunteer be successful, asking how you can help them is a logical thing to add to your feedback. Would they like you to sign them up to repeat a training class? Would they like you to remind them where the procedure book is, or go through a process with them one more time? How can you help them be successful? When we're nervous or uncomfortable, we often will find ourselves just blathering away long after we should have stopped talking. So say what you need to say and then be quiet. Remember that feedback should allow for 2-way communication. Listen to what the volunteer has to say. They might just make some excuses for why they did what they did, or there might be a really good reason that you aren't aware of. For example, what if different staff are giving different directions on how to perform a certain task? Listening to the volunteer not only allows for completion of the feedback loop, it may also help you identify unexpected problems that need to be addressed. If you've ever trained an animal, whether a personal pet or an animal you care for at work, then you're already aware of many of the things we just covered in this presentation. Praise and reward are good, even more so when an animal is learning a new skill. Timing and specificity are everything. Think of clicker training, where you need to click in a timely fashion when the animal exhibits a specific behavior. Our body language reveals way more to the animal than anything we're saying with our words. And our goal is to help the animal be successful, not to turn them into a cowering, insecure mess. If you can use these strategies on dogs, cats, pigs, and parrots, then you can use them on volunteers and coworkers and spouses and children and your annoying Aunt Gertrude. Learning to give feedback will help you build a successful group of volunteers and may also come in handy in other areas of your life.